The most dangerous relationships don't begin with red flags. They begin with a feeling that seems rare, effortless, almost destined. I've seen it happen over and over. A woman who feels immediately familiar. Conversation flows without friction. Intimacy arrives without hesitation. You tell yourself this must be confidence, maturity, emotional depth. You assume you've found someone who simply knows who she is. But what if that ease isn't natural at all? What if what feels like a once-in-a-lifetime connection is actually the result of repetition? What if the warmth you feel isn't intimacy, but refinement, not presence, but practice? Most men are never taught to tell the difference. We're conditioned to trust intensity, to equate comfort with compatibility, to believe that when something feels this smooth, it must be real. It isn't always. Some patterns only become visible once you stop listening to what you feel and start observing what repeats. The signs are subtle. They don't announce themselves. And once you learn to recognize them, you can't unsee them. Before we go further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you value calm, honest analysis like this, consider subscribing. No pressure, just clarity. I remember the first time I noticed it clearly. The setting was ordinary. A house party in a quiet neighborhood outside the city. Nothing dramatic. Music low enough to talk. Drinks poured casually. People moving in small clusters repeating the same conversations they always do. She stood across the room, not performing, not chasing attention. She didn't need to. Attention moved toward her on its own. Men leaned in when she spoke. Conversations bent in her direction without effort. She wasn't loud. She wasn't provocative. She was calm, present, precise. That alone wasn't what caught me. What caught me was how she moved through people. She adjusted without thinking. With one man, she was playful. With another, she was thoughtful. With someone else, she was curious, almost admiring. No friction, no hesitation. It looked natural. Too natural. When we were introduced, she focused completely on me. Eye contact steady, questions measured. Not intrusive, not shallow. She listened in a way that made me forget the noise around us. Within minutes, I felt something familiar forming. That quiet, internal thought men recognize instantly. This feels different. She laughed at the right moments. Not exaggerated, just enough. She mirrored my pacing. If I slowed down, she slowed. If I leaned in, she met me halfway. When I said something personal, she didn't flinch. She accepted it as if intimacy was the most normal thing in the world. Most men interpret that moment as chemistry. I did too once. Chemistry feels rare. It feels accidental. It feels like luck. And when it appears so easily, the mind fills in the story. You tell yourself, this doesn't happen often. That something about you unlocked something in her. But what I was actually watching was execution. There was no awkwardness to overcome, no uncertainty to navigate, no small protective pauses. The interaction moved smoothly, because it had moved smoothly many times before. The rhythm was familiar to her, not because of me, but because of repetition. Men often misunderstand this, because we are taught to look for signals of attraction, not signs of conditioning. When a woman appears immediately comfortable emotionally and physically, we assume confidence. We assume emotional health. We assume she knows herself. Sometimes that's true. But sometimes what we're seeing is erosion. Healthy attraction has friction at the beginning, not resistance, but calibration. A woman who hasn't burned through intimacy carries a natural caution. She listens, but she doesn't reveal everything. She's curious, but not exposed. She allows connection to develop rather than installs it immediately. This isn't fear, it's instinct. When intimacy has been repeated enough times, as the instinct weakens, boundaries that once required trust begin to open automatically. Emotional topics lose their weight. Physical closeness stops feeling significant. What should feel personal becomes procedural. That's when ease appears. The problem is that ease feels incredible to the untrained eye. It feels like alignment. It feels like mutual recognition. Men don't ask where that smoothness came from. We only ask how to keep it. I watched how she handled proximity, how easily she stood close, how naturally she touched an arm, then withdrew, then returned. Each movement timed to produce comfort without pressure. No false steps, no corrections. It was like watching someone who had already memorized the dance. And that's the part most men never consider. You can't rehearse a first moment, but you can repeat it enough times that it stops being new. What feels like spontaneous magic is often muscle memory. The mind doesn't register it consciously. It just responds. Dopamine rises, defenses drop. Attachment begins forming before evaluation has even started. This is where men make their first mistake. We assume that if intimacy arrives quickly, it means we are being trusted. But trust takes time. When it arrives without time, it isn't trust. It's familiarity with the process. That familiarity creates a powerful illusion. You feel chosen. You feel seen. You feel like the center of attention, even if you're one of many who have felt exactly the same thing in exactly the same way. Nothing about that feeling tells you the truth. The truth lives in patterns, not moments. If a woman can create instant emotional resonance with a stranger, it isn't because the stranger is special. It's because the skill is transferable. The same approach works on different men because it's built on predictable responses. That doesn't make her malicious. It makes her practiced. But practice changes things. It changes how connection is experienced. It turns intimacy into a repeatable outcome rather than a shared discovery. Men romanticize that efficiency. We call it chemistry because we don't want to believe intimacy can be mechanical. We want to believe it only happens when two people are aligned. That belief is comforting. It's also dangerous. Because when you mistake technique for connection, you invest emotionally before you understand what you're investing in. You attach to the feeling rather than the person. And by the time you realize the difference, your judgment is already compromised. I've watched men spend years chasing the version of a woman they met in the first hour. They don't realize that version wasn't created for them. It was delivered. The deeper truth is simple, but uncomfortable. The smoother the beginning, the more carefully you should observe what follows. Natural connection reveals itself slowly. It deepens. It changes shape. It survives pauses and misunderstandings. Rehearsed connection peaks early. It shines brightly, then stabilizes into something flatter because the intensity was front-loaded. Most men never make it past the opening acts before committing emotionally. By the time the performance shifts, they're already attached to the memory of how it felt at the start. And that memory becomes the standard they chase. That's why this matters. Not because experience is wrong, not because attraction is dangerous, but because confusing practiced ease with authentic depth leads men into relationships that never evolve beyond their opening scene. The beginning is not the truth. The pattern is. The biggest misunderstanding men carry is simple but costly. We believe that comfort with intimacy is a sign of emotional health. We assume that when a woman opens, quickly speaks freely, and allows closeness without hesitation, She must be secure in herself. That assumption is wrong more often than we admit. There is a difference between confidence and desensitization. Confidence grows from stability. Desensitization grows from repetition, from exposure without integration, from intimacy experienced too often too quickly and without consequence. Healthy intimacy has weight. It creates a pause, a moment of internal assessment. When someone values emotional and physical closeness, they don't hand it out reflexively. They notice how it feels. They calibrate. They protect it until trust has earned access. This isn't fear or insecurity. It's a functioning nervous system. When intimacy becomes routine, that pause disappears. The body no longer registers closeness as meaningful. Emotional disclosure stops feeling vulnerable. Physical contact stops feeling consequential. The protective instinct that once regulated access erodes slowly without the person noticing. Think of a lock that's been forced open too many times. Eventually, it doesn't resist at all. It still looks intact, but it no longer protects anything. That's what emotional erosion looks like. I've seen it in how easily personal topics surface. Childhood stories offered without context. Deep feelings shared before any foundation exists. Confessions delivered with a casual tone of small talk. There's no sense of timing, no sense of sequence. Everything is available immediately. Men mistake that availability for closeness. They feel trusted. They feel included. But what they're actually experiencing is a lack of internal filtration. The same stories, the same disclosures, the same gestures have been used many times before. The moment loses its uniqueness. What should feel earned feels automatic. And automatic intimacy doesn't bond the way men think it does. It excites, it stimulates, but it doesn't anchor. You can feel intensely connected to someone who is barely connecting at all. This erosion shows up physically as well. Boundaries dissolve without discussion. Touch escalates without negotiation. Situations that should carry a trace of awkwardness don't. There's no moment of uncertainty, no reading of signals, no mutual adjustment. Everything flows because it has flowed before. Men rarely question this because awkwardness is uncomfortable. We prefer smoothness. We prefer not having to earn access. When intimacy is offered freely, it feels like relief. But relief isn't depth. Depth requires friction. It requires moments where two people don't know yet, where they have to check in with themselves, where vulnerability comes with risk. When risk is gone, intimacy becomes performance. And performance has a ceiling. That ceiling reveals itself later when you expect the connection to deepen, and it doesn't. When you try to build something lasting on top of something that was never rooted. When you realize that what felt intense hasn't grown, hasn't changed, hasn't become more real with time. It just repeats. Men often say, "She was so open with me from the start." They say it with pride, as if that openness proves the connection was special. But openness without progression isn't a gift. It's a signal. A woman who has preserved her emotional instincts doesn't rush herself. She allows discomfort. She allows silence. She allows curiosity to develop before revelation. That pacing protects both people. When pacing disappears, it isn't liberation. It's numbness. Repeated intimacy trains the mind to bypass evaluation. It teaches the body that closeness is safe, regardless of context. That's not strength. That's adaptation to overexposure. And adaptation changes how someone bonds. You can't recreate the intensity of a genuine first with someone who has turned first moments into routines. The body doesn't respond the same way. The attachment system doesn't activate with the same depth. What feels intense to you may feel neutral to her. That imbalance matters, because bonding that happens unevenly creates instability. One person invests, the other maintains. One hopes, the other manages. The danger isn't that she doesn't feel anything. The danger is that what she feels isn't anchored the way yours is. Her system has learned to move on quickly, to reset, to repeat. Men tell themselves they'll be the exception, that something about them will slow her down, that once she feels real connection, everything will change. But systems don't change because of intention. They change through disruption, reflection, and conscious effort. Without that, they repeat what they know. What feels like incredible chemistry is often just familiarity with the process of creating it. And familiarity removes reverence. It turns intimacy into a tool rather than a shared risk. That's why the beginning feels so good and the middle feels confusing. You start noticing that nothing deepens. Conversations circle. Emotional exchanges plateau. The same closeness exists, but it doesn't grow roots. It doesn't build resilience. It doesn't survive tension. You begin to feel replaceable without being replaced. Close, but not chosen. Intimate, but not bonded. This is where men blame themselves. They try harder. They open more. They give more. They don't realize they're pushing against a capacity limit that has nothing to do with them. The system she's operating from wasn't built for depth. It was built for repetition. And repetition doesn't create connection. It creates efficiency. Once you see that difference, you stop confusing smoothness with substance. You stop romanticizing ease. You stop assuming that comfort equals commitment. Intimacy that matters slows you down. It makes you careful. It makes you present. It makes you aware of what's at stake. When none of that is present, something has already been worn away. Not all damage looks the same. When repeated intimacy reshapes someone's emotional system, it doesn't always make them more open. Sometimes it does the opposite. It builds walls so thick that nothing real gets through. Men usually recognize the first type. The woman who opens too quickly, who moves with ease, who offers closeness without resistance. What's harder to recognize is the other extreme. The woman who seems engaging, warm, even emotionally intelligent, yet never truly reachable. She gives you access, but only to the surface. At first, it doesn't feel like distance. It feels controlled. Conversations are pleasant. She's attentive. She asks about your life. She remembers details. She shares stories about her day, her preferences, her routine. But something is missing. No matter how much time you spend together, certain doors never open. You know what she likes to eat. You know her schedule. You know her favorite shows and places. But you don't know what shaped her. You don't know what she fears. You don't know what breaks her. Every time you approach those areas, the conversation shifts. Ask about childhood, and she redirects. Ask about past pain, and she minimizes. Ask about dreams or vulnerabilities, and she deflects with humor or turns the focus back on you. The movement is smooth, almost invisible. Men often mistake this for boundaries. They respect it. They tell themselves she just needs more time. But time doesn't open doors that are locked by design. These walls don't come from modesty. They come from accumulation, from investing deeply, losing repeatedly, and deciding that vulnerability is no longer worth the cost. Each disappointment adds another layer. Each betrayal reinforces the belief that openness leads to loss. Eventually, protection becomes permanent. She isn't hiding, she's guarding. The result is a relationship that never reaches equilibrium. You give more emotionally because there's space to fill. You share more because she doesn't. You invest because you feel the imbalance and try to correct it. But the imbalance isn't accidental. It's structural. You're building toward depth. She's maintaining distance. The relationship hits a ceiling early, and no amount of effort raises it. You exhaust yourself trying to reach someone who isn't accessible. This is the other side of erosion. On one end, intimacy becomes too easy. On the other, it becomes unreachable. Both lead to the same outcome, a connection that cannot deepen. Men struggle here because the surface is convincing. She appears present. She appears caring. There's no obvious coldness, no cruelty, just a quiet absence where depth should be. And because she performs emotional engagement well, you assume emotional availability exists somewhere beneath it. You believe that if you're patient enough, consistent enough, safe enough, she'll open. But she isn't waiting to open. She's committed to staying closed. These patterns don't develop overnight. They are adaptive responses to history. When someone invests deeply too many times and loses too much, the system adjusts. It learns how to participate without risking exposure. That adaptation allows relationships to exist without vulnerability. She becomes skilled at managing connection without entering it. She can appear involved without being invested. She can receive attention without giving herself. And men misinterpret that restraint as mystery. They think there's something special hidden underneath, something worth uncovering. What they don't realize is that nothing is being hidden. It's being protected. There's another element that reinforces this distance, the presence of multiple male connections. Not always romantic. Sometimes framed as friendships. Sometimes as emotional support. Sometimes as remnants of past relationships that never fully ended. These connections form a network. Ex-partners remain available. Male friends offer validation. Attention flows from multiple directions. This network provides emotional insurance. If one connection falters, another fills the gap. That safety net reduces the need for depth with any single person. Why risk vulnerability when support is distributed? Why invest deeply when replacement is always an option? The system rewards variety, not commitment. Men feel this instinctively. They sense competition they can't name. Not for exclusivity, but for attention, for presence, for emotional priority. You notice how many men text her, how many remain in her orbit from different stages of her life. You notice how defensive she becomes when you question those connections. Not reflective, defensive. That defensiveness isn't about trust. It's about preserving the system. The system works because it prevents dependence. It ensures she is never emotionally alone. But it also prevents deep bonding, because deep bonding requires choosing one direction over all others. When attention is spread wide, attachment stays shallow. Men often try to earn priority in this network. They become more attentive, more available, more accommodating. They don't realize that priority isn't granted through effort. It's avoided by design. The relationship becomes a guided tour of her public self. You see the polished areas, the manageable traits, the agreeable persona. But the parts that require risk remain locked away. And locked doors don't open because someone knocks harder. This is where many men lose themselves. They confuse restraint with virtue, distance with dignity. They tell themselves that wanting more makes them needy. But wanting access to someone you're investing in isn't neediness, it's alignment. And when alignment is impossible, effort becomes erosion. Whether intimacy is too easy or too guarded, the outcome is the same. There is no path to depth. There is only maintenance. A relationship that can't deepen will eventually drain the one who wants it to. Once you recognize this pattern, you stop personalizing it. You stop believing that you're not enough. You stop trying to unlock doors that were never meant to open. Some people aren't unavailable because they haven't met the right person. They're unavailable because availability costs them more than they're willing to pay. And no amount of patience changes that. One of the clearest indicators appears not in what she says, but in how many men surround her life. Not visibly, not loudly, quietly, persistently. At first it seems harmless. She mentions a male friend here and there, an ex she's still on good terms with, someone who checks in occasionally. Nothing dramatic, nothing inappropriate on the surface. But over time, a pattern emerges. There are always men present, men from different phases of her life, men who serve different functions. One listens when she's overwhelmed, another offers validation, another provides help, favors access, or entertainment. Each connection is framed as innocent, each one justified individually. Together, they form a system. This network isn't accidental, it's maintained. Men who have been romantically involved with her remain emotionally accessible. Not because of unresolved love, but because availability benefits her. They stay in orbit, not close enough to threaten a current relationship outright, but close enough to be activated when needed. Male friends occupy ambiguous territory. They're just friends, but you can feel the potential beneath the label. If circumstances shifted, if opportunity arose, the line would blur quickly. This matters because attention is a resource. Emotional attention, time, validation, reassurance. When those resources come from many sources, no single relationship carries real weight. Depth requires exclusivity, not control, but priority. In this system, priority is fluid. Men often sense this but struggle to articulate it. You feel like you're competing without competing. Like your presence matters but not uniquely. Like your absence would be noticed but not disruptive. That feeling isn't insecurity. It's information. Pay attention to how often her phone lights up, how many male names appear consistently, how casually she references conversations with other men. Not to make you jealous, but because it's normal to her. And watch what happens when you express discomfort. A healthy response includes curiosity and adjustment. A defensive response includes dismissal and reversal. You're told you're controlling, insecure, unreasonable. The conversation shifts from the behavior to your reaction. That shift protects the system, because the system depends on uninterrupted access to multiple sources of attention. It ensures she's never emotionally dependent on one person. But emotional independence built this way doesn't create strength. It creates fragmentation. The relationship you're in becomes one node among many, not the center. Men often respond by trying to secure their position. They give more. They become more available. They try to prove reliability. They believe consistency will earn exclusivity. But consistency doesn't compete with abundance. When attention is plentiful, attachment stays light. There's another consequence to this network that men overlook. Emotional energy is finite. When it's distributed across many connections, no single bond receives enough to deepen. Conversations stay surface level. Conflicts are avoided rather than resolved. Growth stalls. You'll notice that when tension arises between you, she doesn't lean in. She leans outward. She talks to others. She diffuses the pressure rather than addressing it directly with you. This prevents rupture, but it also prevents repair. Repair is where bonds form. A system designed to avoid emotional discomfort never learns how to endure it. And relationships that can't endure discomfort can't mature. Men in these dynamics often feel replaceable because functionally they are. Not as people, but as roles. Someone else can listen. Someone else can reassure. Someone else can step in if you pull away. This isn't cruelty, it's structure. And structure determines outcomes. The presence of this network also explains why some women appear emotionally composed during breakups. They don't collapse because support is already in place. The transition is buffered. The loss is spread out. Men misread this composure as strength. They don't realize that resilience built on substitution avoids grief rather than processing it. Avoided grief accumulates. That accumulation feeds the very patterns that prevent depth in the next relationship. Walls get thicker. Systems get tighter. Investment becomes more controlled. You'll also notice something else. Many women who maintain these networks have limited close female friendships, or strained ones. Female relationships require mutual vulnerability without romantic leverage. They require accountability. They don't offer the same validation structure. Male attention is easier to manage. This isn't about morality. It's about incentives. The network rewards availability without commitment. It offers support without demands. It allows emotional expression without reciprocity. But it comes at a cost. When a woman is surrounded by male attention, she rarely has to confront herself fully. Discomfort gets outsourced. Loneliness gets diluted. Self-reflection gets postponed. And relationships require self-reflection to grow. For the man involved, this dynamic creates constant low-grade competition. Not dramatic rivalry, but subtle comparison. You feel the need to stay interesting, to remain engaging, to justify your place. That pressure erodes safety. You don't relax into the relationship. You manage yourself within it. And relationships that require management never feel secure. This is why recognizing the network matters early. Not to demand isolation, not to impose control, but to understand whether the structure of her life supports depth or resists it. If attention is spread wide, intimacy stays shallow. No amount of effort changes that. No amount of patience converts abundance into focus. Focus is a choice, and systems reveal what choices someone is prepared to make. One of the most damaging shifts happens quietly after intimacy has lost its meaning and attention has become currency. It's the moment closeness stops being an expression and starts becoming a tool. At first, you don't notice it. Intimacy feels natural. Affection flows easily. Physical closeness arrives without tension. Emotional warmth feels generous. You assume this is how healthy connection works. Then patterns begin to form. You notice that intimacy increases at specific moments. After disagreement, when she wants reassurance, when she senses distance, when something needs smoothing over, when she wants something without asking directly. And just as predictably, intimacy disappears when tension arises. Arguments don't lead to conversation. They lead to withdrawal. Affection cools. Touch disappears. Emotional warmth shuts down. The message is clear, even if it's never spoken. Closeness is conditional. This is where intimacy becomes transactional. It's no longer something shared because it's felt. It's deployed because it's effective. Used to reward, withhold, regulate, and influence. When you behave in alignment with her expectations, intimacy returns. When you don't, it's removed. Men often don't recognize this because the exchange is subtle. There's no explicit bargain, no stated rules, just emotional cause and effect. You begin to adjust your behavior. You soften your boundaries. You avoid certain topics. You choose words carefully. You hesitate before expressing frustration. Not because you're afraid of conflict, but because you've learned what conflict costs you. This creates a dangerous shift. You stop being present. You start performing. Love becomes something you earn rather than something you receive. Affection becomes feedback. Intimacy becomes a signal that you're doing something right. And when intimacy as currency, security disappears. Because currency can be revoked at any time. This dynamic prevents authentic bonding. Real bonds form when intimacy is stable, when closeness remains during disagreement, when connection doesn't disappear under stress. Transactional intimacy teaches the opposite. It trains you to associate honesty with loss and compliance with reward. Men in this position often feel anxious without understanding why. They sense instability. They feel like they're always one misstep away from emotional distance. They become hyper-aware of tone timing and reactions. This isn't sensitivity, it's conditioning. Over time, you lose access to your own needs. You stop asking for what you want. You focus on maintaining access rather than building connection. And the relationship shifts from mutual to managed. This system benefits one side more than the other. The person who controls intimacy controls the emotional temperature of the relationship. They decide when things feel close and when they feel distant. The other person adapts. Men often justify this dynamic by telling themselves that relationships require compromise, that emotional regulation is part of maturity, that patience will stabilize things. But compromise is mutual. Regulation is shared. Stability doesn't come from one person holding the switch. When intimacy is used strategically, love becomes negotiation. You'll notice that during conflict resolution never fully arrives. Issues fade when intimacy returns, but nothing is resolved. The underlying problem remains untouched. The cycle resets. Conflict, withdrawal, reconnection, repeat. This loop creates emotional exhaustion. You invest energy into maintaining peace rather than building truth. You suppress discomfort to avoid distance. Over time, resentment grows quietly, and resentment corrodes attraction. The most damaging part of this dynamic is what it teaches you about yourself. You begin to believe that love is fragile, that being fully yourself risks abandonment, that stability requires constant self-monitoring. None of that is true in a healthy bond. Healthy intimacy doesn't vanish under pressure. It adapts. It changes tone, but it remains present. It creates safety, not leverage. Transactional intimacy creates the opposite. It produces compliance, not closeness. Dependence, not trust. Men often mistake the return of intimacy as proof that things are fixed. They feel relief. The tension dissolves. They cling to that relief and ignore the pattern. But relief isn't resolution, and relationships built on relief never feel secure. This dynamic is especially powerful when combined with the patterns already discussed. When emotional erosion removes instinctive boundaries, when networks of attention reduce exclusivity, when depth is avoided, intimacy becomes the easiest control point. It's fast, it's effective, and it avoids accountability. Because instead of addressing issues directly, intimacy smooths them over. Instead of negotiating needs, openly affection is adjusted. Instead of mutual effort, one person manages the emotional economy. Men often stay far longer than they should because the highs are convincing. When intimacy returns, it feels like love again. You remember why you stayed. You forget the instability. But the price is clarity. You lose sight of whether you're loved for who you are or rewarded for how well you perform. And once that question enters your mind, security never fully returns. Real connection doesn't require earning access. It doesn't punish honesty. It doesn't teach you to trade parts of yourself for closeness. When intimacy becomes a bargaining chip, the relationship stops being a partnership. It becomes a system of incentives. And systems like that don't lead to peace. They lead to quiet erosion. There is a moment that confuses men more than almost anything else. It's when a woman seems to understand you instantly, not gradually, not through shared experience, immediately. She knows what to say before you finish the thought. She anticipates reactions. She soothes at the right time, challenges at the right time, pulls back just enough to keep you engaged, then leans in when your attention starts to drift. You tell yourself you finally met someone who gets men. What you're actually seeing is pattern recognition. This kind of understanding doesn't come from empathy. Empathy develops slowly. It requires exposure, listening adjustment, and vulnerability on both sides. What you're witnessing is applied knowledge, observation refined through repetition. She has seen the same reactions before. She knows what men respond to because she has tested it across different people, different contexts, different stages of attachment. She knows which emotional buttons produce which behaviors. That knowledge feels intimate because it's precise. Men mistake precision for connection. She creates emotional volatility in controlled doses. Just enough uncertainty to trigger your focus. Just enough distance to activate pursuit. Just enough warmth to reassure you before anxiety turns into detachment. This push and pull doesn't feel manipulative when you're inside it. It feels passionate, alive, charged. But intensity is not depth. Depth is steady. It unfolds. It survives calm. It doesn't require spikes to feel real. What she's managing is your emotional arousal, not your emotional safety. You notice how highs feel unusually high, how lows feel unsettling, how resolution feels euphoric. That emotional swing creates attachment, not because of connection, but because of chemistry amplified by unpredictability. This is intermittent reinforcement, the same principle that makes habits hard to break. Rewards that arrive inconsistently create stronger attachment than rewards that arrive reliably. Your nervous system stays alert, scanning for the next moment of closeness. You confuse this alertness with love. Genuine connection doesn't keep you on edge. It calms you. It grounds you. It makes presence easier, not harder. But when someone understands masculine psychology through observation rather than empathy, they can manufacture experiences that feel meaningful without requiring mutual vulnerability. You start noticing that conversations orbit around emotional stimulation rather than emotional truth. Problems appear and disappear without ever being fully examined. Conflicts feel dramatic but unresolved. Intensity substitutes for intimacy. Men often rationalize this by saying the relationship has spark, that it's not boring, that it feels alive. But stability isn't boredom, it's capacity. And when capacity is missing, intensity fills the gap. Another sign appears in how quickly she identifies your insecurities, not to exploit them overtly, but to work around them. She knows when to praise, when to withhold, when to reassure, when to challenge your confidence just enough to make validation feel valuable. Again, this doesn't feel cruel. It feels attuned. But attunement without vulnerability isn't connection. It's calibration. She may share just enough of her own emotional experience to appear open, but those disclosures are controlled. They don't expose her. They don't require response. They don't create reciprocity. They function to deepen your investment. Men often believe this dynamic means the woman is emotionally intelligent. In reality, emotional intelligence without accountability becomes emotional leverage. You'll notice that her understanding of men doesn't evolve over time. It arrives fully formed. She doesn't learn you. She applies you to an existing framework. True understanding grows. It adjusts. It makes mistakes. It corrects itself. Applied understanding feels flawless because it's generalized. This is why many men feel replaceable in these dynamics. Not because they are interchangeable as people, but because the system doesn't require specificity. The same emotional strategies work across different individuals. When you begin to pull back, she senses it quickly. Not because she's deeply connected to you, but because she's tracking engagement levels. She responds with increased intimacy, heightened emotion, or subtle vulnerability. You re-engage. The cycle continues. Men often stay trapped here because the experience feels meaningful. They believe intensity equals depth. They believe emotional labor equals investment. They believe being needed equals being valued. But being managed isn't being chosen. The most telling detail is how quickly she understands you compared to how little she reveals herself. You feel seen. She remains unknown. That asymmetry creates imbalance. And imbalance creates dependence. Men in these relationships often feel drained without understanding why. They give emotional energy continuously responding to shifts, managing reactions, stabilizing dynamics. They don't realize they're being kept in motion. Motion prevents clarity. When everything feels emotionally charged, you don't stop to evaluate. You react. You respond. You stay engaged. Genuine connection allows stillness. It doesn't require constant stimulation to stay alive. Once you recognize this pattern, you stop mistaking emotional choreography for intimacy. You stop confusing psychological fluency with care. Care reveals itself in consistency, in presence during conflict, in willingness to be uncomfortable together, in shared responsibility for emotional outcomes. Applied understanding avoids all of that. It produces feelings without foundations, attachment without security, intensity without growth. Men often believe they can outgrow this dynamic, that if they remain grounded, the relationship will stabilize. But systems built on emotional management resist stability because stability removes leverage. When intensity fades, the system loses its function. That's why many of these relationships end suddenly or collapse once emotional stimulation can no longer be sustained. The connection doesn't deepen. It dissipates. What felt powerful wasn't fragile because it was new. It was fragile because it wasn't real. Understanding this distinction changes how you evaluate attraction. You stop chasing how something feels and start observing how it behaves over time. And behavior never lies. Another shift happens quietly, and most men don't recognize it until damage has already been done. It's the loss of discretion, the moment when intimacy stops being private and starts being casual. You hear it in how she talks about her past. Stories of previous relationships come out easily, not with reflection, not with care, but with the same tone someone uses to describe a weekend trip or a job they once had. Details surface without hesitation. Name situations, conflicts, endings, all delivered without weight. At first, you might appreciate the honesty. You tell yourself she's open, transparent, comfortable in her own skin. But comfort isn't the same as respect. When intimacy has been experienced repeatedly, it loses its sense of containment. Moments that should feel personal stop feeling protected. What was once sacred becomes conversational. You notice that boundaries around private experiences are thin, sometimes non-existent. When you express discomfort, her response matters. A healthy response includes understanding, acknowledgement, adjustment. But here concern gets reframed. You're told you're insecure, immature, judgmental. The focus shifts away from the behavior and onto your reaction. This is how discretion erodes. Someone who understands the value of intimacy protects it instinctively. They don't need rules. They don't need reminders. They feel internally that certain details belong inside the relationship, not outside it. When that instinct is gone, everything becomes shareable. And if past intimacy is treated casually, present intimacy will be too. What you experience together won't be held carefully. It becomes material, a story, something that can be repeated later with someone else. Men often ignore this because it feels abstract, until it isn't. Until you realize that moments you thought were private were discussed elsewhere. Until you sense that nothing you share is truly contained. Until trust starts leaking in small, quiet ways. This loss of discretion is tied directly to another revealing pattern: repetition. Listen carefully to how she describes her relationship history. Not the details, but the structure. The arc is always the same. Intense beginning, rapid escalation, constant communication, emotional closeness early, a sense of destiny. Then collapse, usually fast, usually blamed on circumstances, timing, the other person's flaws, bad luck, different men, same story. Each relationship is presented as unique, yet every outcome mirrors the last. There's no reflection on what stayed consistent, no acknowledgement of personal contribution to the pattern. Responsibility is externalized. Men believe their situation will be different because the early stage feels special. They don't realize that the same intensity existed at the start of every failed connection. The intensity isn't a sign of compatibility. It's a signature. This pattern reveals addiction to novelty, to the rush of new attention, to being desired intensely, to constant emotional stimulation. The beginning becomes the goal. But lasting relationships aren't built in beginnings. They're built in middles, in routine, in boredom, in conflict, in repair. If someone has never stayed long enough to build those skills, they don't suddenly appear when the right person arrives. They remain undeveloped. You'll notice that when things calm down, she becomes restless. When communication stabilizes, she seeks stimulation. When emotional intensity drops, dissatisfaction rises. She confuses peace with emptiness. This is why relationships end at similar points. Once novelty fades, there's nothing to replace it. No depth to lean on. No capacity for steady connection. And instead of learning from this, the pattern repeats. New person, same arc, same collapse. Men often believe that pointing this out will help, that awareness will create change. But awareness without accountability does nothing. If someone doesn't see themselves as part of the pattern, they have no reason to change it. This repetition also shows up in social media behavior. Attention is cultivated continuously. Posts designed to attract response, photos calibrated for validation, stories crafted to provoke curiosity and engagement. This isn't expression, it's maintenance. You realize she can't go long without attention. Silence unsettles her. Validation regulates her mood. Likes and messages stabilize her sense of worth. Depth threatens this system because depth narrows attention. It asks for focus. It reduces options. Broad attention feels safer. Men compete not only with real people, but with digital ones, with dozens of ongoing micro-connections. Emotional alternatives that never fully end. This constant comparison creates a shopping mindset. You're evaluated against other options, against past experiences, against imagined alternatives. You feel it when she hesitates to commit, when standards shift, when requirements change, when the goalposts move. She says she wants something serious, but behavior avoids seriousness. Future plans stay vague. Decisions get postponed. Commitment feels perpetually just out of reach. You feel like you're auditioning for a role that doesn't exist. This mindset prevents gratitude. It prevents appreciation. Because when someone is always evaluating, they're never fully present. You become temporary even when nothing is wrong. Men often internalize this as personal failure. They try to be better, more impressive, more accommodating. They don't realize the issue isn't quality, it's orientation. Someone who approaches relationships like options doesn't settle into investment. They optimize for satisfaction, not growth. That orientation doesn't disappear because of love. Love doesn't override systems, it exposes them. And when disappointment follows protection increases, emotional capacity shrinks further. The ceiling lowers again. You start feeling it as an invisible limit. No matter how much you give, something doesn't open. No matter how long you stay, something doesn't deepen. That limit isn't about you. It's about what repeated experience has taken away. As time goes on, the patterns stop hiding in emotion and start showing up in structure, in how the relationship is organized, in what it avoids, in what it never becomes. One of the clearest signs appears when the conversation turns toward the future, not fantasy, not vague statements about someday. Real planning, decisions that require commitment, coordination, and shared responsibility. This is where momentum stalls. She may talk about wanting a serious relationship. She may say she values stability. She may describe herself as selective, cautious, even relationship-oriented. But when planning moves from words to action, something shifts. Timelines remain undefined. Plans stay flexible. Commitments become conditional. You suggest practical steps forward, living arrangements, financial coordination, long-term goals, not demands, just conversations. The response is evasive. Topics get redirected. Jokes deflect seriousness. Promises stay general. We'll see. Let's not rush. Things are good as they are. Nothing progresses. Men often accept this at first. They tell themselves patience is maturity, that pressure ruins relationships, that letting things unfold naturally is wise. But time reveals the truth. Natural unfolding still unfolds. When nothing ever solidifies, avoidance is at work. This avoidance isn't always conscious. It's often the result of never having practiced commitment. Short-term relationships don't teach how to integrate lives. They don't develop skills for negotiation, compromise, and sustained cooperation. Those skills only form when people stay. When someone has never stayed long enough to build them, they don't suddenly appear because the right partner arrives. You begin to notice deficits. Normal disagreements escalate quickly. Minor conflicts trigger withdrawal or threats of leaving. Compromise feels foreign. Preferences are defended rigidly rather than negotiated. There's little experience working through difficult periods together. No reference point for weathering storms without destabilizing the relationship. Instead of conflict leading to repair, it leads to distance. You feel like stability itself creates anxiety, that calm periods are uncomfortable, that something always needs to be stirred. This is where many men feel the relationship is unstable, but can't name why. Nothing dramatic is happening. No betrayal, no obvious cruelty. Just an underlying fragility. The fragility comes from lack of foundation. Long-term partnerships require different capacities than dating. They demand emotional regulation, delayed gratification, shared problem-solving, willingness to be inconvenienced for something larger than immediate satisfaction. If someone has optimized their life around short-term connections, these capacities remain undeveloped. They may excel at attraction, at excitement, at beginnings, but maintenance feels draining. Development feels threatening. You see this in how problems are handled. Issues are avoided rather than addressed. Conversations circle without resolution. The same conflicts repeat because nothing is built to contain them. Men often respond by doing more emotional labor. They try to stabilize, to reassure, to plan, to hold the relationship together. But when effort isn't reciprocated structurally, it becomes draining. Another revealing sign appears in how she compares. Not always aloud. Sometimes subtly. Sometimes unconsciously. You sense that you're being measured. Against past partners. Against imagined alternatives. Against standards that shift depending on mood or circumstance. You're evaluated rather than appreciated. This comparison mindset treats relationships like consumer choices. Satisfaction is tracked. Options are kept mentally open. Commitment feels risky because it closes doors. Gratitude doesn't develop in this framework. Presence doesn't deepen. The relationship remains provisional. You feel it when she hesitates to invest fully, when she avoids merging lives, when she keeps escape routes available. Men often try to outcompete this mindset. They try to become the best option. They don't realize that options themselves are the problem. Depth requires choosing, and choosing requires letting go of alternatives. Another structural issue emerges around emotional labor. She expects understanding, patience, and support without offering the same in return. Your emotional needs are secondary. Your concerns get minimized. You're expected to tolerate volatility, to absorb mood shifts, to remain stable regardless of reciprocity. This creates exhaustion. You begin to feel like the caretaker rather than the partner, the stabilizer rather than the equal. You manage emotions rather than share them. That imbalance doesn't come from cruelty. It comes from habit. If someone has always relied on others to regulate their emotions, they don't suddenly learn mutual regulation in one relationship. You'll also notice resistance to shared responsibility. Decisions that require joint sacrifice get avoided. Compromises feel one-sided. Independence is emphasized, but only when it protects avoidance. True independence includes responsibility. This version avoids it. And then there's money. Not dramatic demands at first, subtle tests. Comments about struggles timed around moments of closeness. Mentions of expenses that invite rescue without asking directly. You offer help once, then again. Then it becomes expected. Watch her reaction when you don't. Does warmth cool? Does disappointment surface? Does emotional distance appear? These reactions reveal whether sharing was genuine or strategic. Financial boundary testing isn't about greed. It's about assessing extractive potential, about determining how much resource flow can be established without reciprocal contribution. When combined with lifestyle patterns that rely on male support, this becomes clearer. Men who drive her, fix things, solve problems, provide access, offer validation. She appears independent, but functionality depends on a network. True independence handles life without constant rescue. Men often confuse being needed with being valued. They step into roles that feel meaningful. They don't realize they're being integrated into a system designed to distribute load rather than build partnership. When that system is disrupted, you'll see instability, emotional swings, crisis, urgency, which leads to the next pattern. Artificial drama. Crises appear when your attention shifts. Problems escalate when you assert boundaries. Emergencies arise during your busiest periods. These crises demand immediate emotional investment. They reinforce your role as caretaker and problem solver. Once attention is restored, the crisis fades. This isn't coincidence. Chaos becomes a tool for maintaining engagement. Stability threatens attention. Drama restores it. Healthy relationships don't require constant crisis management. And finally, narrative control. Listen to how stories change over time, how details shift, how past partners are described, how blame is consistently externalized. Inconsistencies aren't memory lapses. They're adjustments. Information is revealed strategically. Not all at once, just enough to maintain attraction without triggering pattern recognition. Sophisticated explanation replaces accountability. Psychological language reframes behavior. Skepticism gets labeled judgment. All of this serves one function: to prevent you from seeing the system as a system. Once you do, clarity arrives quickly, and clarity changes everything. What matters most in life is not how intense something feels in the beginning, but how it behaves over time. Attraction can be loud, chemistry can be overwhelming, but neither of them guarantees safety depth or longevity. Those are built quietly through consistency, accountability, and mutual effort. One of the hardest lessons to learn is that love is not proven by how much you're willing to endure. It's proven by how much you're allowed to be yourself without fear of losing connection. When you find yourself shrinking, over-explaining, or constantly adjusting just to keep closeness alive, that isn't devotion, it's erosion. Real connection doesn't require you to abandon your standards. It doesn't punish honesty. It doesn't ask you to trade clarity for hope. The right relationship will feel calmer as it deepens, not more confusing. It will expand your sense of self, not narrow it. People rarely change their patterns just because someone loves them. Patterns change only when they're recognized, confronted, and consciously rebuilt. Hoping that intensity will turn into stability is one of the most expensive emotional mistakes a person can make. Your time matters. Your emotional energy matters. Your standards are not obstacles to love. They are filters that protect it. If something in this message resonated with you, I'd like to hear from you. Leave a comment and share what stood out or what you've experienced. These conversations matter more than people admit. And if you value thoughtful, grounded reflections like this, consider subscribing to the channel. No hype, no pressure. Just honest insight meant to help you choose better, live clearer, and protect what matters most.